Somewhere in the jungles of Panama, a phone rang out into empty static, over and over, for 11 straight days, while two young women who should have been found alive were never found in time. This is one of the strangest missing persons cases of the last decade, and by the end, you'll understand why investigators still can't agree on what really happened. Before we go any further, if stories like this keep you up at night wondering about the truth, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to this channel, and it makes sure you never miss the next case we crack open together. Now, let's get into it. The town of Amersfoort, tucked into the Dutch province of Utrecht, looks at first glance like just another postcard pretty corner of Europe. But beneath its charm lies a dense and peculiar history that has shaped both its present and the spirit of the people who call it home. Back in 1661, 400 townsfolk dragged an enormous boulder into the city center as part of an outrageous bet. At first, the stunt became a point of local pride, but as time passed, residents realized just how ridiculous the whole affair had been, and they buried the stone out of embarrassment. Years later, it was dug back up, and today it stands as a quirky monument to that strange chapter of the town's past. Centuries after that, the Second World War left a deep scar on Amersfoort. Yet once the conflict ended, the town rebuilt around the handful of things its people held dear, becoming a cozy, tight-knit place once again. It was in this environment that two Dutch girls, Chloe Fletcher and Sophie Whitmore, grew up, shaped by the town's rich culture. At one point in their lives, they decided to set off on an adventure through Central America, specifically to Boquete, Panama, a place known equally for its beautiful scenery and its dangers. In 2009, for instance, a 29-year-old English backpacker named Alex Turner vanished without a trace in Boquete, in the province of Chiriquí. He was last seen leaving his hostel with plans to visit the Majagua waterfall. He never came back, and no trace of him was ever found, as if the forest itself had swallowed him whole. 5 years later, in 2014, Chloe and Sophie would wander into that same region, with no idea they were walking toward a similar fate. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Edward Ashworth, and welcome to another episode of Bone Collector. Today, we're diving into the baffling case of two Dutch women who vanished in Panama and everything surrounding their disappearance and deaths. Chloe Fletcher and Sophie Whitmore met as teenagers, working part-time together at a small cafe and restaurant in Amersfoort. Their friendship quickly deepened over the years. Chloe was known as loud, chatty, and unmistakably outgoing. Sophie, on the other hand, was quieter, but very active in sports, especially volleyball. Though reserved, her skill on the volleyball court earned her plenty of friends, but the strongest bond she had was, without question, with Chloe. Over the years, their friendship went through a brief stretch of distance when they chose to study at universities in different cities. Chloe went to Utrecht University for art education, while Sophie studied applied psychology in Deventer. By late 2013, both in their early 20s, they were wrapping up their studies and decided to move in together in a kind of student housing back in their hometown of Amersfoort. Chloe was already living there and managed to talk Sophie into moving in too. Around that time, Chloe told Sophie about a recent trip to Peru she'd taken with her family, where she'd fallen completely in love with South America. Inspired by that trip, Chloe suggested the two of them travel somewhere to celebrate their graduation and kick off summer break. So, over the following 6 months, they started saving money to make it happen. Sophie, who had no experience traveling internationally, was a little nervous at first, but the idea of leaving the Netherlands to experience a new language and culture was too appealing to pass up. In 2014, a few weeks before the trip, the two worked together at a restaurant called In den Kleinen Hap, finishing up the last of the money they needed. Chloe had been eyeing Costa Rica, but after plenty of back and forth, they settled on Panama, specifically Boquete in Chiriquí, a region that promised richer, more varied experiences. For the trip, Chloe and Sophie found a Dutch exchange agency offering a package to Boquete that included several stops, a homestay with a host family, and a Spanish course through a language school network called Spanish by Locations. On top of that, they'd also teach English to local students in the area. The offer won them over instantly, and they signed on without hesitation. The agency handled every detail, and soon the full itinerary was locked in. Their flight was booked for March 15, 2014. That day, the two of them met at the airport with their families, who, until then, had never met each other. Before boarding, Chloe and Sophie promised their parents they'd check in daily throughout the trip. The journey was long, but they finally landed in Costa Rica, where they were picked up and guided to the Panama border. Their first moves in an unfamiliar place were full of nerves. At the border, an official demanded a specific stamp, which briefly made them think they'd been scammed, but they made it through immigration without any real trouble. From there, a car took them to a boat, which carried them to Bocas del Toro Island. They spent a few days there and had a great time. In their journals, Chloe and Sophie only mentioned a few complaints about the food and some stomach trouble from the local spices, which they'd more or less expected given the change in culture. In total, they spent 2 weeks in the area, making friends with 2 Dutch travelers and a handful of other students, with whom they went to parties and bars around the island. After that, Chloe and Sophie made their way to their final destination, Boquete in Chiriquí. There they were welcomed at the Spanish by the River School, part of the same exchange network. By the time they arrived, both girls were completely worn out from the heat and the rush of travel. They stayed with a host family run by a woman named Miriam Grant in a private room. Miriam's family, who had hosted exchange students for years, welcomed them warmly. Sophie wrote in her diary that the trip was going well, but admitted she was already missing home. She'd also been struggling with a foot fracture from a few months earlier, sustained during a volleyball game back in the Netherlands. It's fair to say Sophie wasn't in her best physical or even mental shape, though she was trying hard to make the most of the experience. Chloe, meanwhile, seemed to be loving every minute of it, brimming with enthusiasm. Part of Sophie's frustration came from an administrative mix-up at the Spanish by the River School, where they were supposed to begin their volunteer teaching and Spanish lessons. When they arrived, staff told them they weren't expected for another week, meaning they'd shown up early. Confused, Chloe and Sophie contacted the agency back home, who confirmed the correct date had indeed been given to them, and that the mistake was on the school's end. The school staff scrambled to make sure the girls had something to enjoy while they waited. Over the next few days, with time on their hands, Chloe and Sophie decided to look into local attractions. That search led them to the well-known Pianista Trail, named for its steep steps that are said to resemble piano keys. Set on hiking it, on April 1st, Chloe and Sophie were seen by Miriam and her family leaving the house with small backpacks and water bottles in hand. They didn't say where they were headed, only that they were going to walk around town. Their first stop was a cafe, where a few people later said they found it odd to see the girls carrying such small backpacks with just 2 bottles of water between them. Everyone knew the local trails were grueling, and given the intense heat, the girls would need far more supplies than that. But sadly, no one thought to warn them. Around 11 a.m., a taxi pulled up outside the Spanish by the River School and drove Chloe and Sophie to the trailhead of the Pianista Trail, a hike expected to take a little over 2 hours, up and roughly the same back down, about 5 hours round trip in total. When they arrived, Chloe pulled out her phone, which had the trail map downloaded through Google Maps. Before starting their climb, they were briefly spotted by the owner of an Italian restaurant near the trailhead. Supposedly, the restaurant's dog tagged along with them, something it apparently did with every hiker who set out on the trail. A few hours later, though, the dog came back alone, which worried the restaurant owner, since the animal usually stuck with hikers the whole way up and down. That initial unease, just a passing suspicion at first, would soon curdle into real dread, as the whereabouts of the 2 young Dutch women became the center of one of the largest search operations the region had ever seen. Would you like me to continue with the next part? This next section covers the disappearance being reported, the search efforts beginning, and the first strange clues. Historia. Continuação foi how night fell. Miriam Grant and her family noticed Chloe and Sophie hadn't come home, but at first they weren't too worried. After all, the girls were adults and could choose to spend the night wherever they liked. Still, the two of them had plans for the next morning. They were supposed to meet a guide named Fernando at the Spanish by the river school. As a way of making up for the earlier scheduling mistake, the school had hired Fernando, considered one of the most experienced guides in the region. So Fernando showed up early that morning and waited for the girls, but after a few minutes, he started to notice they were running late. Worried, he went to the front desk, where he was met by a new employee, a German woman named Greta. Aware of the delay, Greta decided to walk over to the house where the girls were staying, which was close to the school. When she got there, she found no one home and called Miriam Grant, who mentioned there was a spare key that could be used to check whether the girls were simply still asleep. So Greta and Fernando let themselves in and went to Chloe and Sophie's room. They stayed there a good while, but found nothing out of place. Given the situation, Fernando decided to seek help from the authorities, though at first without much luck. Still, he reasoned the girls might have gone to the Pianista Trail and headed there alone to look around. Unfortunately, he found no sign of them. Meanwhile, Chloe and Sophie's parents back home were growing anxious over the lack of news. It wasn't until late in the evening of April 2nd that the guide finally managed to get the police's attention, and the disappearances were officially reported. With help from a few witnesses, the first investigators learned that some people had heard the girls mention wanting to explore the Pianista Trail. Following that lead, they tracked down the taxi driver, Manuel Rodriguez, who confirmed he'd dropped the two of them off at the start of the trail. The staff at the nearby Italian restaurant were also interviewed, and all of them recalled seeing Chloe and Sophie head into the trail. With this information in hand, suspicion quickly settled on the idea that the girls had simply gotten lost. By then, both families had already been informed, somewhat accidentally through the school's administration, that Chloe and Sophie were missing. Desperate, the families reached out to Dutch authorities, who immediately contacted Interpol. Interpol, in turn, quickly alerted Panamanian officials. Soon after, both families flew to Panama, determined to follow the search efforts closely and find out what had happened to their daughters. On the morning of April 3rd, a helicopter flew over the jungle in search of the girls, but nothing could be spotted from above. To make matters worse, that same evening, a violent storm with heavy rain and thunder hit Boquete, making the search even harder. The case was handed over to Panama's civil police, working alongside Dutch authorities, and over the following days, the search continued along the Pianista Trail. On April 7th, a team of officers even spent the night in the jungle, using light signals and searching intensively for clues, but came up empty. The following night, Special Forces units tried the same light signal method for at least 3 straight hours, again without success. On April 9th, search dogs were brought in starting in the morning and continuing into the night, when once more they attempted to use light signals to locate the girls. Still nothing. Through all these attempts, the families waited, watching closely, consumed by anguish over the lack of answers. Within days, the director of the National Civil Protection System, Arturo Alvarado, announced that roughly 25 regional routes through the park had been checked, including the Los Quetzales Trail to the northeast. In total, the search team included 40 Special Forces rescuers and another 35 National Police agents. But, with no progress to show for it, the case was briefly handed to the Judicial Investigation Directorate, and a few days later, to the Public Prosecutor's Office. And once again, the lack of headway brought nothing but frustration. In an effort to help, the families pooled together roughly $30,000 as a reward for any information leading to Chloe and Sophie's whereabouts. Still, The days dragged on with no discoveries. Both families gave numerous interviews, and Sophie's father, David Whitmore, stated they would stay in the region until his daughter was found. By late May, another 18 rescuers and 12 trained dogs arrived from the Netherlands to help with the search in person. Around the same time, the public prosecutor's office argued that the initial search efforts had been poorly organized, possibly contaminating any evidence that might have led to the girls. Director Arturo Alvarado firmly denied these accusations, though suspicions lingered until the investigation's end. It seemed the early lack of progress was, at least in part, chalked up to the authorities' own missteps. This prompted more rescuers and specialists from the Costa Rican Red Cross to be brought in. This group focused their efforts on the region's hot springs, where some witnesses claimed to have seen the girls the day before they vanished. In the days that followed, for reasons unclear, the search and investigation began operating more quietly, spreading out to other towns and homes around Boquete. On June 1st, the Costa Rican Red Cross team was redirected to search the Los Quetzales Trail, aiming to trace the entire path back toward town. By that point, the whole team, including the search dogs, who were finally given a break, hadn't had a single day of rest. The next day, some searches shifted back to the outskirts of town. A non-profit rescue organization called Redding's Honden was also brought in by the prosecutor's office to help. However, by early June, having found no trace of the girls, both that organization and the Costa Rican Red Cross ended their involvement and left Panama. During this period, many theories began to circulate about what might have happened. Some believed Chloe and Sophie were injured and unable to walk. The worst-case scenario was avoided in conversation, but everyone understood that if that were true, their bodies would likely be found soon. Sometime later, the Dutch rescue team also called off their search, concluding that, given the circumstances, Chloe and Sophie might no longer even be in the region, raising the possibility of abduction. Still, hope persisted. The truth is, the Pianista Trail runs just over 8 kilometers, cutting through densely wooded terrain filled with streams and cliffs. According to one guide interviewed, it's the kind of place where a lot can go wrong. And indeed, though not considered a difficult trail, it can quickly turn treacherous in the rain, which is exactly what happened during the first days of the search and continued on and off through much of that first week. Curiously, opinions about the Pianista Trail became quite divided during the search. At first, it was described as very difficult, but later, people said it was well marked and not an easy place to get lost in. These conflicting accounts raised questions about what could really have happened, and more importantly, how Chloe and Sophie could have possibly gone missing. Had they taken an alternate path? The answer, it turns out, is yes. That's entirely possible. It was a theory that many experienced local rescuers were convinced of. Hikers who'd done the Pianista Trail before mentioned hidden waterfalls accessible only by side paths, ones typically recommended only with a guide. Beyond that, at the end of the main trail, there's a path leading toward other trails not officially part of Pianista. In other words, they may have reached the end of the marked trail, taken in the view, and then continued down an unfamiliar path. Even today, it's easy to find TripAdvisor reviews mentioning that the trail isn't well marked and that hikers risk taking a wrong turn, though others say that with Google Maps, it's hard to get lost at all. As the search dragged on, it became harder and harder to theorize about what had happened to Chloe and Sophie. The search team, the prosecutor's office, and Panama's civil police avoided publicly floating theories, since search and rescue operations aren't run on guesswork but on specialized analysis and tracking techniques. Even so, there's no denying that the total absence of any solid lead seemed to haunt the authorities. Then, a little over 2 months after the disappearance and the start of the search, authorities, locals, and the families would get a brief and gruesome glimpse into the final days of Chloe Fletcher and Sophie Whitmore's lives. Gostaria que eu continue com a próxima parte? Essa próxima sessão cobre a descoberta da mochila e os primeiros vestígios encontrados. On June 14th, 2014, Panama's civil police received a phone call from an indigenous woman who had something interesting to share with investigators. According to her, she had found a backpack on the bank of a river near her village, Alto Romero, in the province of Bocas del Toro. The item was quickly identified as belonging to Sophie Whitmore. At first, authorities assumed the backpack had simply been carried there by the river current, but the woman insisted it hadn't been there the day before. Investigators also noticed the bag was in surprisingly good condition, as if it had been kept somewhere else, away from the harsh conditions of the jungle. It was also noted that heavy rain had fallen in the days following the girl's disappearance. And yet the backpack, which wasn't waterproof, was completely dry. Still, the details here get contradictory. According to a 2014 report from the Panamanian broadcaster TVN, the senior prosecutor of Chiriquí, Elena Ibarra, stated that the backpack showed signs of dragging and physical wear. She suggested Chloe and Sophie might have been swept along one of the river's tributaries, known locally as the Culebra, which flows into the Changuinola River in Bocas del Toro. The bag had one strap partly torn loose, its plastic clasps broken, discoloration on the fabric, and frayed, torn sections of cloth. Inside the backpack, investigators found both girls' phones, Sophie's Samsung Galaxy and Chloe's iPhone, pair of sunglasses, $83 in cash, Sophie's passport, her camera, a water bottle, and 2 bras. As soon as the discovery went public, rumors began to swirl. The first question people raised was how the backpack ended up so far from where the girls had last been seen. The area was remote and hard to reach. Only locals really knew how to get there. To the public, it seemed almost impossible that 2 young women with no proper gear could have made it that far. Investigators, meanwhile, focused their attention on carefully examining the backpack itself. It quickly became clear the item had passed through many hands before finally reaching the authorities. That's because the indigenous woman who found it had first brought it home and told her husband, and the 2 of them contacted friends before eventually notifying the police. Proof of this came later, when 13 distinct fingerprints were lifted from the backpack, 12 from the phones, and 6 different sets from the bras. Lab analysis determined that 2 sets of prints found on the bras belonged to women. Unsurprisingly, none of the locals admitted to having touched the items, and police were never able to identify whose prints they were. The evidence had been compromised, and although identifying everyone who'd handled the bag should have happened, for whatever reason, it apparently never did. This was arguably the most important piece of evidence found up to that point. Yet investigators didn't seem to treat it with the weight it deserved. All they did was organize new search teams and send them to comb the area where the backpack had turned up, hoping for more clues. And that's where they found Chloe's blue denim shorts, caught on a tree partially submerged in a waterfall on the Culebra River. Contrary to a common misconception, the shorts weren't found neatly folded or placed atop a rock, as many sources claim. They were snagged and torn, with holes in them, in a small waterfall, the kind of spot where any loose debris would naturally get caught, just a few kilometers from where Sophie's backpack had been found. Not long after, in that same area, several sets of bones were discovered, including a rib bone, a femur, and a tibia. The search team also found an unsettling patch of skin and tissue which, through DNA testing, was identified as belonging to Sophie Whitmore. Alongside these remains was a shoe with a severed foot still inside it. These discoveries immediately shifted the case's classification to a crime against life and personal safety. In a wider sweep of the area, around 33 additional scattered bones were located and identified as belonging to both Sophie and Chloe. What stood out most, though, was that the forensic pathologist believed the remains might have been tampered with by a third party. This suspicion grew stronger when he noticed that Chloe's and Sophie's bones were at different stages of decomposition and showed traces of a chemical substance. However, neither the specialists nor the pathologist could determine whether this difference came from chemical interference or simply from the soil where the bones were found. So the lab began investigating whether the bodies might have been dismembered through treatment with chemical agents. If a body is covered in calcium oxide, for instance, certain extremities can detach, which would also explain why some of the bones were found stripped clean of flesh. This theory gained traction when Sophie's foot was found, seemingly severed, yet still inside her perfectly laced sneaker. According to the pathologist, the foot likely came loose due to corrosive exposure. Given all that, the forensic lab's initial theory was that the girls had been attacked and killed, and that whoever was responsible had used powerful chemicals to speed up decomposition, which would explain the differing stages of decay across parts of the bodies. That theory, however, was later downplayed by authorities, who argued the differing decomposition stages could simply mean the girls died at different times. This view gained more traction once Panama's police lab began examining the items found in the backpack, particularly the phones and the camera. Through these devices, investigators managed to build a timeline of events, one that would soon be filled in by a series of unsettling photos recovered from Sophie's camera. Gostaria que eu continue com a próxima parte? A próxima sessão cobre a análise dos celulares, a cronologia das ligações de emergência e as fotos misteriosas tiradas na câmera. Analysis of the phones revealed that 6 hours after they began hiking the Pianista Trail, Chloe tried calling the emergency number 112. A few minutes later, another attempt was made, this time using Sophie's Samsung Galaxy S. Unfortunately, neither call went through due to poor signal in the area. On April 2nd, Chloe tried again. Throughout the morning and afternoon, Sophie made at least 3 attempts to reach emergency services, including dialing 911. None of these attempts succeeded, except for one brief moment when the phone managed to pick up a flicker of internet signal, which quickly dropped again. On the morning of April 3rd, Chloe made one more attempt to call for help, again without success. That was the only attempt made that day, and Sophie apparently switched her phone off to conserve battery. The following day, neither of them tried to reach anyone, and Sophie's Samsung Galaxy finally died. Twice, April 5th, someone made the first attempt to unlock Chloe's iPhone with an incorrect passcode. Over the following days, this happened repeatedly, until on April 11th, the iPhone was powered off for the last time at 11:56 in the morning. Given all this, it became clear that Chloe and Sophie were alive throughout much of the search period. What reinforced this even further were the hundreds of photos found on Sophie's Canon camera. The earliest photos showed the moment they began climbing the Pianista Trail. Sunny skies, both girls looking excited about the hike. The images capture just how varied the terrain is along the way. On a rainy day, it's easy to imagine how slick and treacherous it must get deep in the forest. But it was the photos taken at the top of the trail, at a lookout point known as El Mirador, that started raising eyebrows. At first, these photos looked much like the earlier ones. Chloe and Sophie smiling, seemingly in good physical shape, suggesting the climb hadn't drained the supplies they'd brought for the trip. But the photos didn't stop there. It seems they kept going. Based on the sequence of images, investigators believe the girls may have wanted to find more scenery to photograph, or perhaps were searching for one of the region's hard-to-reach waterfalls. At that point, the simplest explanation was that they thought it was still early enough to push a little further, and ended up getting lost. The next few photos seemed to support this, showing Chloe photographed near a stream close to El Mirador. This is the last photo ever taken of Chloe. After that, there's a 7-day gap before new photos start appearing. In total, around 90 flash photos were taken between 1 and 4 in the morning on April 8th. The photos appeared to have been taken deep in the jungle, in complete darkness. Investigators also noticed that in some shots, the girls appeared to be near ravines or rivers. Other photos, however, seemed to make no sense at all. Strange, disorienting images, one showing what looks like an intense beam of light. In the photos that follow, the pattern continues with shots of trees, until things get stranger still. Images showing scraps of paper, what looks like a strap, perhaps from one of the backpacks, and a reflective object. Zooming into the scattered papers, one appears to match a fragment of a map seen in earlier photos from the hike. Overall, these photos left investigators baffled, but one in particular stands out, an image that, at first glance, seems to show nothing meaningful at all. And yet, one internet user who compared the image against Sophie's face got a startling result. The question that remains, though, is, was there any reason for them to be photographing themselves in a situation like that? Investigators never commented on these photos individually. From what we know, they believe the pictures were taken either as a way of signaling for help or simply to navigate through the pitch-black forest. One detail that supports this theory is that many of the photos were taken roughly 2 minutes apart, a strange, almost methodical detail. More than 10 years later, the true purpose behind these photos remains uncertain. When these images first surfaced, the one that drew the most attention showed what appeared to be blood on the tips of Chloe's hair. It turned out not to be blood at all, but rather a flash effect on her red hair. Curiously, several photography students who examined the images closely claimed the original photo of Chloe's hair had been cropped and that it originally showed more people in frame. They based this on the fact that the image was recorded at 1280 x 960 pixels with a 1.33 aspect ratio, while the Canon PowerShot SX270, the model of Sophie's camera, normally shoots at 4000 x 3000 pixels at that same 1.33 ratio. So, according to these students, the photo had been cropped but kept at its original proportions. They also point out that cropping typically causes pixelation, affecting fine details along the edges of certain objects. And in the photo of Chloe's hair, the pixelation does appear to show up at the sides, as if there was more originally visible there. With that in mind, let's step away from the official explanations for a moment and consider a much more unsettling theory, one that suggests someone else was behind these photos. To explore this, we need to remember that Sophie's Samsung Galaxy battery died on April 4th. In the days that followed, Chloe's phone screen was turned on several times, but the passcode was never successfully entered. To some, this suggests it might not have been Chloe holding the phone at all, especially since, in one instance, the code was entered incorrectly. Additionally, between April 7th and 10th, Chloe's iPhone shows no signs of use at all, a complete blank stretch of 4 days, with the only activity being the flash photos taken on the 8th. This has led to suspicion that the photos weren't taken by the girls themselves. Some armchair sleuths have theorized that other people may have been toying with Chloe and Sophie while photographing them. One detail that fuels this theory is a discovery made by police themselves. One of the photos on the camera had been deleted, but apparently not in the usual way. Normally, if you take 2 photos in sequence, say photo 1 and photo 2, and then delete one right after taking it, the file numbering of subsequent photos adjusts automatically. But if you plug the camera into a computer and delete a photo from there, the file numbering stays the same, as if the deleted photo still existed. Either way, it looked as though the camera had been used for some other purpose entirely, anything but documenting something meaningful. Around this time, the remains of Chloe Fletcher and Sophie Whitmore were released to their families so they could hold funerals back in the Netherlands. Gostaria que eu continue como a próxima parte? A próxima sessão cobre a investigação particular da família Fletcher, a expedição forense holandesa de 2015 e as novas teorias sobre um acidente. In August 2014, a few months later, Chloe Fletcher's family decided to launch their own private investigation, feeling the authorities weren't treating the case with the seriousness it deserved. They also chose to hold off on the funeral until more answers came to light. A 25-minute video, still available on YouTube today, documents Chloe's parents retracing the entire route along the Pianista Trail. During that hike, they compared certain points along the path with the photos found on Sophie's camera, hoping to uncover new evidence about what might have caused their deaths. The investigation was supported by at least 2 guides, including Fernando, the same guide who had first alerted authorities on the day the girls went missing. Still, they found nothing new, and the search proved frustrating in more ways than one. Over the following months, the investigation remained fully under Panamanian control, and in November, Dutch police concluded, based on everything found and the autopsy reports, that the most plausible explanation was that Chloe and Sophie had gotten lost in the forest and suffered fatal injuries, possibly from a fall off a cliff. This would have resulted in both their deaths, though officials admitted they couldn't entirely rule out third-party involvement. In other words, the authorities of the girls' home country were looking the families in the eye, families who remained deeply confused by the whole case, and telling them the cause of death couldn't be determined with certainty. The family's greatest hope had rested on Dutch authorities, who had provided resources and support to help them stay in Panama. Now, with that support withdrawn, an even deeper frustration set in for both families. But there was nothing they could do. Dutch officials had never had the authority to run investigations on Panamanian soil, which left them limited and entirely dependent on the progress of the local investigation. And so, with the Dutch team's departure, the case began moving toward its official close. After Sophie and Chloe's remains were returned to their families, both families were left with the unsettling feeling that Panamanian authorities were, in some way, rushing to shut the case down. In response, in January 2015, a team of Dutch forensic experts, including members of the non-profit organization RHWW, traveled from the Netherlands to Boquete to carry out one final search on behalf of the Fletcher family. It's worth noting that the Fletchers had remained persistent about the case for so long, partly because they weren't fully convinced by the earlier DNA results on the remains that had been found. Even though they suspected the truth, they stayed focused on recovering whatever remains hadn't yet been found, and hopefully uncovering new evidence. The team's mission was to recover as many unfound remains as possible, and if they could, dig up new leads on what had happened. Panama's civil police reacted neutrally to this initiative and offered a few officers to assist with the search. Over the following months, the team conducted a thorough, detailed analysis of the different scenarios considered most likely. To do this, they combed every area that fed into the Culebra River, where Chloe and Sophie's belongings had originally turned up. The team, however, ran into limitations, since water levels had dropped since the initial search, likely carrying away several potential clues. In their early conclusions, the team stated it was essentially impossible for Chloe and Sophie to have gotten lost on the Pianista Trail itself. According to the group's leader, a Dutchman named Frank Goodwin, anyone suggesting the girls got lost on the trail simply had never set foot on it themselves. That said, after examining the geographic and social circumstances of the case, the group also concluded that crimes like robbery, sexual assault, violence, or attempted kidnapping seemed highly unlikely. Just because it's nearly impossible to get lost on the Pianista Trail doesn't mean it's impossible to have an accident there. This became especially clear when the team examined the final descent of the trail, where the terrain seemed to create real potential for a fall. This theory gained weight from the fact that, had they fallen in that section, they would have ended up on the banks of a river that fed directly into the Culebra River, right where their remains were ultimately found. The team also tried to retrace the path toward where the remains had originally been discovered, but weather conditions prevented it. With help from locals, guides, and specialists, they noted that the photos taken on the night of April 8th suggested the presence of a steep cliff, one they believed the girls might have been swept toward by rising water. To put it plainly, the team believed that, at the moment those photos were taken, the girls weren't wandering through open forest. They were trapped in an area boxed in by a slope at least 40 meters high, one that would have made it impossible to climb back out. Since the bodies weren't found until 2 months after their deaths, it's quite likely the remains scattered due to decomposition, weather, and wildlife activity. It was also noted that Chloe's tibia showed a type of inflammation typically caused by excessive walking or intense physical strain, suggesting she may have been the first of the two to succumb to her injuries. This lines up with the fact that someone, likely Sophie, repeatedly tried to unlock Chloe's iPhone afterward. While this investigation was underway, the remains believed to belong to Chloe Fletcher were examined at a Dutch forensic institute, which confirmed her identity. In March 2015, the team finally concluded that the cause of death was accidental. This final attempt, along with the confirmed identification, finally led the Fletcher family to accept the group's explanation and begin funeral arrangements. Panamanian authorities closed the case with the same conclusion, adding that the girls may have tried to cross a particularly dangerous and unstable bridge without proper equipment and suffered a fatal fall during the crossing. That's officially how the case was closed, and the account of their deaths follows that same line to this day. Panamanian authorities even placed a memorial cross in the area, along with signage warning tourists not to venture beyond that point, which is considered hazardous. Still, even though the case was officially closed, news stories kept surfacing in the months and years that followed. For instance, people continued to point fingers at the two Dutch backpackers who'd been seen talking with Chloe and Sophie, treating them as likely suspects. In truth, they had been interviewed during the original investigation, but police found no connection between them and the disappearance. They were simply friends of the girls, and they were nowhere near Boquete on the day the girls vanished. Another supposed lead that surfaced in later years came indirectly from Ingrid Lawson, who ran the Spanish by Location school network. Apparently, back in April 2014, she posted on Facebook that on the day Chloe and Sophie disappeared, two people, including a staff member, had seen the girls leaving the school. That staff member was Greta, the German employee who had only been working there for about 2 weeks. According to later findings, after the girls vanished, Greta asked to swap posts with another employee stationed in Panama City. She left Boquete entirely, staying far away from everything unfolding in the region. Some speculate Greta may have seen or heard something that frightened her, since, curiously, on the day the girls disappeared, she'd been quite active alongside guide Fernando. Over the course of this whole saga, she became something of a mysterious figure, drawing the interest of a few journalists. Later, in Germany, Greta gave an interview and made some controversial statements about the girls' time at the school. Fernando himself, the guide who first raised the alarm about the disappearance, also became a suspect for many people over the years. Of course, there was no real way he could have been involved. At least, that's what authorities believed, since he was the first to notice something was wrong and to seek help, making him a key witness to the entire timeline of the disappearance. Still, there's one curious detail. The area where Sophie's backpack was found sat quite close to some land belonging to Fernando. Some sources even claim the indigenous woman who found the backpack went to Fernando first to tell him about it, knowing he'd likely be involved in the search. What's more, when search teams were organized by authorities, Fernando took an active role and was present when the first bones were discovered. Notably, he still works as a guide in the region today and remains well respected among locals. However, in mid-2019, a woman who had hiked the trail alone posted a review on TripAdvisor describing what she called a frightening experience with Fernando, which reignited old questions. In her account, she said that although Fernando was quite charming, at several points he got uncomfortably close and made advances toward her. After she turned him down, she claimed he told her he could cut off her legs with a machete. It's worth noting, though, that this review dates back to 2019, and to this day, that same profile has never posted another review on the site, which makes it entirely plausible the account was created solely to tarnish the guide's reputation, especially considering how many positive reviews he otherwise has. At the same time, public opinion has tried to link him to the case since the very beginning, and he reportedly even lost his wife over the constant accusations that he was somehow the killer. These days, Fernando avoids discussing the case altogether, saying the whole ordeal has brought him a great deal of sorrow. Interestingly, in March 2024, a new review caught our attention on TripAdvisor. A woman who had reviewed several other local attractions before described the trail with Fernando as frightening, adding that there was no sense of safety and that being around him felt intimidating. Besides Fernando, a second guide, who had also served as a witness in the case, ended up under suspicion too. This guide originally claimed to have seen the girls on the trail, but couldn't say for certain it was them, reasoning that all Europeans look alike. Yet it's hard to deny that Chloe and Sophie stood out, especially given Chloe's red hair and Sophie's height. Years later, this same man posted photos from the Pianista Trail online, and in one of them, he's seen standing right beside the memorial cross dedicated to the girls. That alone doesn't prove any involvement, but it is, at the very least, a little unsettling. But the strange details don't stop there. In mid-March 2015, almost a year after the girls disappeared and around the same time the Dutch team was conducting its new investigation, taxi driver Manuel Rodriguez, the man who had dropped Chloe and Sophie off at the trailhead, was found dead in a river. Suspicion pointed to drowning. At the time, his death raised some eyebrows publicly, but it would take years for these circumstances to become truly alarming. That's because, both before and after Manuel's death, more bodies would surface, all supposedly connected in some way to the disappearance and deaths of Chloe Fletcher and Sophie Whitmore. Gostaria que eu continue com a próxima parte? A próxima sessão cobre o podcast investigativo de 2022, as teorias envolvendo a gangue local e a conclusão do caso. To make sense of what comes next, we need to jump forward to 2022, more than 10 years, after Chloe and Sophie's disappearance and deaths. During this period, a new version of events reached the public. Though not an official one, it came from journalist Nathan Cole, who had covered the case for years, along with his colleague Marissa Duarte. Determined to dig deeper into the case, the two of them traveled to Boquete, Panama. During their investigation, they gathered enough material to launch a podcast called Lost in Panama. Through their findings, they released several episodes, laying out two competing theories, both tied directly to the death of taxi driver Manuel Rodriguez, mentioned earlier. But to walk through this theory properly, a few things need clarifying first. The first is that, based on everything we've covered so far, it seems increasingly unlikely Chloe and Sophie actually got lost or died on the Pianista Trail itself. Instead, they may have gotten lost while hiking a different trail altogether. According to the podcast, they may have taken the Pata del Macho Trail. For whatever reason, authorities apparently never put much effort into searching that particular trail, since it was considered hard to access and notoriously muddy. With that established, let's continue. The first theory laid out by the podcast centers on the account of a witness named Rosa, mother of a young man named Marcos Delgado, who becomes very important going forward. According to her, Chloe and Sophie were on the Pata del Macho Trail when they were found by members of a local gang and taken to the neighborhood of Palo Alto, an area situated along the rivers and trails. There, they ended up at the home of a criminal known as Cuervo, someone they apparently already had some contact with. It seems Chloe and Sophie had befriended these young men without realizing they were part of a gang. The day before, they'd supposedly bought marijuana and gone to a party with them. According to this version of events, realizing they were being taken against their will deep into the jungle, both girls tried calling for emergency help. Rosa claimed that at Cuervo's house, the group attempted to sexually assault Chloe and Sophie, but the girls fought back and were killed. The crime scene was then cleaned up, and their remains were placed in bags and buried near a mango tree on the criminal's property, where the group allegedly tried to speed up decomposition using chemicals. Once the search for the girls began, gang members reportedly stayed quiet until, as the search efforts wound down, they disposed of the victims' remains and belongings. So where does this Marcos fit in? He was found dead in a shallow part of a river just days after the girls disappeared. At the time, Panama's civil police knew Marcos had gang ties and treated his death as a settling of scores within the criminal underworld. According to the podcast, though, he'd been questioned by police in connection with the Dutch girl's disappearance. In his statement, Marcos allegedly said he'd seen Chloe and Sophie in the bed of a red pickup truck belonging to a local young man named Diego. He wasn't alone, though. Also in the truck was Marco, the son of guide Fernando. That same red pickup was reportedly linked to other witness accounts from around the Pianista Trail area, though this was never investigated further. According to Rosa, Marco was the leader of this small criminal outfit in the area and had orchestrated Chloe and Sophie's murder. It seems all the members of this group were sons of influential people in Boquete. What makes this even more interesting is a rumor about a photo supposedly found on Marco's phone, showing him alongside two young women and another man. Speculation suggests the women in the photo were Chloe and Sophie, and the other man was Roberto Salinas, who was also found dead not long after Marcos. Roberto reportedly died in a hit-and-run, though the podcast suggests he was actually murdered. And as we already know, a few weeks later, taxi driver Manuel Rodriguez, the man who dropped the girls at the trailhead, was also found dead in a river, just like Marcos. In this account, Roberto Salinas, in a statement about his connection to Chloe and Sophie, mentioned that Marco might know something, but that he was nowhere to be found. When Marco eventually turned up, he claimed he'd been at his father Fernando's house. Worth remembering, Fernando's property was close to the area where the backpack was later found. Marco was never formally investigated, but on the Lost in Panama podcast, one witness claimed police tried to interview him, and Fernando wouldn't allow it. It seems, in general, authorities were fairly lenient with this particular group of locals. Nathan Cole and Marissa Duarte also claimed to have discovered that the indigenous woman who found the backpack didn't actually call the police first. She called Fernando's brother, who then contacted Fernando himself. Later, both Fernando and his brother would go on to help with the search efforts organized by the Fletcher family, once again showing up as active participants throughout the entire saga. A few other witnesses interviewed for the podcast claimed to have seen Chloe and Sophie at a nightclub where Marco was also present. The second theory raised by the podcast suggests the girls may have instead been taken to Roberto Salinas' family farm and killed there. The podcast also argues that the strange, nonsensical photos taken deep in the jungle on April 8th were actually taken by Marco, who had gone missing during that stretch of time in order to manufacture evidence and confuse the police. The entire group, according to this theory, cooperated to make the case look like an accident involving two lost foreign tourists rather than a homicide. Supposed anonymous sources inside Panama's Forensic Institute reportedly told the podcast's journalists that the case had always been treated internally as a homicide, but that pressure from above led to reports being written in line with the version favored by the prosecutor's office. Under this version, it's quite plausible the girls' deaths were the result of organized crime activity in the region. Of course, given that most of the people involved in these theories are now dead, it's easy to see how that creates fertile ground for rumor, something common enough in a small town like Boquete. The Fletcher family has stated that they recognize the girls in the photo as resembling Chloe and Sophie, but insist it isn't actually them. In 2020, the Dutch Public Prosecutor's Office also declared the photo inauthentic. So does the Lost in Panama podcast hold up? The photo reportedly came from an unknown source, was taken on an unknown phone, on an unknown date, with nothing tying it concretely to the case. It supposedly turned up on the phone of one of the young men Chloe and Sophie may or may not have known. Some sites speculate the photo might have been taken on April 1st, when the Ikaj group allegedly met the girls on the trail and went swimming together before they were killed. Could that be what happened? At this point, there's simply no way to know for certain. And now, finally, let's bring this case to a close. More recently, forensic anthropologist Diane Foster, who handled the autopsy of skeletal remains belonging to a young man who vanished on a trail in Costa Rica, reviewed the autopsy report from the Dutch girl's case and stated that nothing in it points to homicide. As for the whitish appearance of the bones, she explained this could simply be the result of the region's soil composition and natural exposure to the elements. Chloe and Sophie may have gotten lost in the forest and chosen to follow the river, believing it would lead them back to town. A common strategy people turn to when disoriented, and one the girls may well have reasoned through in their desperation. Unfortunately, though, the Culebra River, which cuts through the region, doesn't actually lead back to civilization. If they followed that logic, they likely wandered deeper and deeper into the jungle. During the days they were missing, a massive downpour hit the region, and the river may have risen sharply. Under this scenario, they could have been swept along by the current and suffered severe injuries. What remains most puzzling, though, is that only parts of their bodies were ever recovered, unusual for cases like this. In the case mentioned earlier, the Yungik man who disappeared in Costa Rica's Corcovado National Park had his bones discovered 2 years later, with cause of death listed as a falling tree. Similar cases include a Dutch woman and an Australian man who also vanished together in the Bribri region of Costa Rica. They'd set out together on a trail that experts found unusual, since it wasn't the kind of place people typically chose to hike. And it was also known for organized crime activity. The woman's body was found first, 3 kilometers from where their belongings had been located, propped against a rock, with cause of death listed as starvation combined with an infection in one of her injured ankles. The man was found a year later, about 800 meters from where her body had been. His cause of death, however, was never determined, and much like Chloe and Sophie's case, the couple's trail seemed to simply vanish along a riverbank. At the time, one theory suggested they'd been fleeing from something and left in a hurry, abandoning several belongings and following the river, though the deaths were ultimately ruled accidental and natural. Weighing everything, it's plausible that nature itself simply turned against these 2 young women, who seemingly stayed alive through much of the search, only to never be found in time. This whole story stands as the height of what an unresolved case can look like. Not a case that was ever truly buried, but one that was, technically, closed. To this day, the only figure from this saga still remembered, discussed, and even judged is Fernando himself. Browsing TripAdvisor, you'll find he's genuinely well-liked among tourists who've hiked Pianista, though a handful of isolated comments express unease. Some openly admit to being nervous about doing the trail because of the guide's presence and what happened to Chloe Fletcher and Sophie Whitmore. After all, for many, doubts about Fernando's innocence still linger. He was, after all, the first to head out to the Pianista Trail, looking for the girls, even without knowing for sure they were even there. He also willingly took part in the search and hiked the trail alongside the Fletcher family, hoping to find clues. Are these simply the actions of an experienced, dedicated guide who genuinely cares about the people who venture onto his beloved trails? Or is there something hidden behind that calm, smiling face seen in tourist photos on TripAdvisor? These may be unfair questions to ask, since not even the authorities ever named Fernando as a likely suspect or tarnished his standing as a local resident. Strip away the rumors, and there's really nothing that clearly ties him to the case. Either way, the doubts persist. The fact remains that, today, Phuket continues to be a popular tourist destination, but so too does the number of disappearances and crimes against tourists, which continues to climb. In 2017, a 23-year-old American woman, Rachel Simmons, was reported missing on Isla Colón in the coastal province of Bocas del Toro after disappearing while hiking in the area. A few days later, her body was found showing signs of strangulation and sexual assault. Her killer was later identified as a 17-year-old who was arrested and tried as an adult, receiving a 12-year sentence. Also in 2017, a German backpacker got lost while hiking near the town of Santa Fe in Veragua province. The case drew widespread attention, since heavy rain that same day caused landslides, flooding, and road closures. She was eventually found by 3 members of Panama's civil police. But instead of being brought to safety, the young woman, still traumatized from the ordeal, was abducted, sexually assaulted, and robbed by the very officers meant to rescue her. The search continued for 3 more grueling days, until she managed to escape her captors after fighting one of them off. Shortly after, she was found by a joint task force investigating her disappearance. When located, she was disoriented but quickly recounted what had happened. The 3 men responsible were sentenced to between 12 and 15 years in prison. Cases like these quickly brought Chloe Fletcher and Sophie Whitmore's disappearance back into public conversation, stirring up even more debate. Interestingly, when journalists Nathan Cole and Marissa Duarte traveled to Boquete to investigate the Dutch girl's case, they discovered that since 2014, at least 14 more women had disappeared under similar circumstances. In their podcast, they noted that disappearances and violent incidents don't seem to be uncommon in the region at all, a detail that makes today's case feel even murkier. And yet, despite all this speculation, the Fletcher and Whitmore families have both stated they're at peace, with the case being officially closed as an accident. Which leaves us with one final question. Is there really a hidden truth behind these 2 young women's deaths? Or are we simply staring too long into the darkness, conjuring our own demons out of tragedy?